Have you ever waited weeks for a network connection? You don't have to. With Megaport, you can spin up connections in minutes, scale bandwidth on demand, and extend your network to over 930 data centers and 280 clouds worldwide. No more waiting, no more contracts, and no more fixed bandwidth limits. Just a private, high-speed network that gives you total control over how you connect. And here's the best part. You can try Megaport for free. Packet Pushers listeners can get a port or a Megaport cloud router completely free for the first month to experience how quickly and seamlessly you can interconnect data centers and clouds and scale networks across regions. Go to megaport.com/trymegaport and start deploying scalable connectivity in minutes, not months. That's megaport.com/trymegaport. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to Heavy Networking, your podcast for all things networking since 2010. I am Ethan Banks with Drew Conray Murray, and you can follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, and please do. Our guest today is Andrew Ohanian. Andrew's made a free web-based workbook for CCIE Service Provider candidates, and it's got a ton of labs in it, an absolute ton. You can find all that at ccie-sp.gitbook.io, and you can have free access to that workbook with all the container lab YAML you can stand. And Andrew's going to update us today on the CCIE Service Provider track with his perspective on going through that track and getting certified, and then talk us through his workbook offering. Andrew, welcome to Heavy Networking. And man, it's the first time you've been on the show. Thank you for joining us. And would you tell everybody briefly who you are and what you do?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be here. I'm based in Dallas, Texas. Been a network engineer for about 8 years now. I started in the traditional route switch enterprise world, and I made a transition into service provider networking about 4 years ago. So I've been at a regional fiber-based service provider, and then I just recently started a new job at a large WISP in Central California.
Nice. Okay, well, I suppose by that description, I think question one here might be answered, but let's ask it anyway. Why CCIE Service Provider? What was interesting to you about that track?
Yeah, so the service provider track just had a lot of benefits and interesting things to me over the route switch or enterprise track. So even if I was not, it's obvious I was in the service provider area. But even besides that, the service provider track goes much deeper into routing and forwarding mechanisms compared to the enterprise track, just in my opinion. An example of this might be multicast. So multicast is a topic on both tracks, but on the service provider track, you're going to do multicast even deeper. You're going to do multicast in an L3 VPN. It's called multicast VPN. So it's like multicast within multicast. You've got the customer's multicast, you've got the service provider multicast. You can do things different ways. So that's just kind of one example where something that's on both tracks just goes a little bit deeper in the service provider track. There's a little bit more complexity, which kind of drew me in. Then the service provider track is also less Cisco proprietary now, in my opinion, versus the enterprise track. Back in 2019, Cisco switched the RS CCIE to enterprise infrastructure. And along with that switch, there were a few Cisco proprietary products added. And I saw a lot of buzz online of people just kind of upset with this. They were saying, "Oh no, what happened to my route switch CCIE that was kind of this, in a way, vendor neutral expert exam. Of course, it's configuring Cisco routers, but everything you're learning there can be applied anywhere else on any vendors. And now they've added these Cisco specific things that you're learning. I found this kind of interesting blog that did a analysis of both blueprints of the enterprise and the service provider, and they calculated that the enterprise track is 48% Cisco proprietary, and the service provider track is only 12%. So it kind of validated people's intuitions that, on enterprise, you're doing SDA now, SD-WAN, even things like HSRP are kind of Cisco. And the automation is all APIs with Cisco's products, vManage and DNA Center and stuff. And the service provider track is much more open, OSPF, BGP, multicast, MPLS, QoS, carrier Ethernet. Even the security is not Cisco security products. It's BGP flow spec, remote trigger black hole. These are all things that are driven through RFCs and industry standards, and not really driven through Cisco's internal development and stuff. And not that there's things wrong with that. It's just that really appealed to me, that with the service provider track, I felt like I was learning service provider networking just holistically. And I just happened to be configuring this on, Cisco boxes.
So you
And
felt like you were getting deeper into the protocols themselves as opposed to what's
yeah,
the CLI for this thing I want to do on a Cisco box?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and even before I went into the Cisco service provider certs, I actually did some Juniper service provider certs to get even more of that perspective. Like, I don't want to think of OSPF as the Cisco commands. I want to think of OSPF as OSPF and be able to configure it on different boxes and vendors, and I felt like that gave me that mindset of I'm dealing with I know the protocol. I don't just know how to configure it
Mm.
on Cisco.
So you're separating out how the protocol behaves versus specific commands to do things.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly. Yeah.
that's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that the commands don't matter. It's just that, Andrew, I'm with you on the thinking process. You want to understand at a high level how everything's working, and the commands become incidental. It's the things you
Exactly.
need to type to implement that overall
Exactly.
concept
Yep.
in your head. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And in the service provider world, so many service providers are using multiple boxes. They might use Cisco here. Okay, now they got Juniper. Okay, now they got Nokia.
Mhm.
So the ability to know the protocols in a vendor neutral way is just really, really good. It's something that is really useful there.
It seems like a very Russ White kind of approach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, then in the service provider track, you also don't have like any GUIs. Everything is completely CLI, even the automation is CLI. So like the automation is mostly NSO, and that's all a CLI. So
NSO is in the network service orchestrator product.
exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's the big automation section on the exam that's been added in like the new version 5. Um, and what's also nice about the service provider exam is that it's super easy to lab. There's just this very low barrier of entry to study for it because the exam itself is completely virtual. It's just 3 different types of nodes. It's a bunch of XRV9Ks, some CSR 1000Vs, and then like one very lightweight Linux node for NSO. So yeah, with enterprise, I don't know that much about it. But what I've seen is that like I think you might want real Catalyst switches to like do SDA and DNA Center. I think it can be virtualized, but it's got like this crazy RAM, requirements like 256 gig RAM or something that just
Hmm.
gives you that little bit of barrier of to be able to just jump into studying some of those things. Um,
So what sorts of industries or business segments are running the kinds of networks that I would be prepping for the CCIE SP?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different industries that if they run like large service provider style networks, they would really benefit from having somebody with CCIE SP on their team. Um, I think of things like DC providers, cloud providers,
Mhm.
research institutions, education, government networks, places where they might have like a large WAN. Um, Even things like financial institutions could be a good fit because they have these special requirements for like very low latency, really high uptime, multicast, and the CCIE SP kind of goes a little bit deeper into some of these things, like with fast reroute and stuff, maybe more than enterprise. Um,
It's kind
uh,
of interesting you said cloud because when you say to me SP, I sort of put it in this sort of like kind of legacy bucket, whereas
yeah,
cloud networking is a little bit feels a little bit more modern, but you feel like it can apply if I'm at a cloud provider or in that space.
yeah, it probably depends a lot, but the nice thing about the current CCIE SP is that it's very updated. There's so much next gen stuff, especially with segment routing, SRv6.
Mm.
If these providers, hyperscalers and stuff are running things like that, they would really benefit from somebody with a CCIE SP. Even the CCIE SP goes into EVPN and stuff, so you kind of get this mindset of underlay and overlay technologies and stuff that's it kind of blends a little bit into data center. And there's even a lot of stuff on the service provider track about like interworking SR with a data center SR domain or EVPN domain and stuff. So yeah, it's definitely very applicable. There's even maybe segments like content distribution networks, things that are large and they have like a lot of BGP peerings and they have traffic engineering requirements and special BGP policy stuff that the CCIE service provider holder would be really well equipped to handle that stuff, maybe a little bit more than route switch. But yeah, all of these places are, they have these requirements for like maybe multi-tenancy and L3 VPN and L2 VPN, really high uptime and traffic engineering, and with service provider you go really deep into getting under 50 millisecond failover in your IGP and that kind of stuff.
Mm.
So so yeah, I think all these places would be interested in somebody with the CCIE SP. Um, and then of course there's a lot of service providers. There's a lot of service providers that are forward thinking and migrating into segment routing and EVPN and stuff, that are interested in people that know this. Even if they don't run Cisco necessarily. I mean, if they do run Cisco, you're jumping in and you're immediately able to start making contributions. But even if they run Juniper and Nokia and stuff, all these things are. It's just a matter of learning that particular vendor, to
Sure.
get up and running with them.
So I'm also curious. You said you're at a WISP now, a wireless internet
Hmm.
service provider.
Hmm.
Um, was there anything in SP about the wireless side, particularly for a WISP, where you're dealing with spectrum and issues like point-to-point, multi-point links, and having to deal with things like just the physical medium you're working through? Does the SP touch on that at
Yeah.
all, or is that like in a whole other area you had to get into?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting network because they're a very big WISP. They have I'm working on unwired broadband, and they've got about 30,000 subscribers and maybe about 220 towers. And their network kind of looks like a really big provider network where like each tower is kind of a pop. So they have these really unique traffic engineering requirements where like the wireless backhaul um, bandwidth is not like you can't just make it 100 gig fiber really easily. So they have all these traffic engineering requirements of pushing traffic where the bandwidth is available. In terms of like the RF stuff, I haven't been working with that too much. We have kind of a separate team that kind of handles all those sorts of things, and that was actually kind of my concern joining a WISP is that like I don't really know about RF, but what they are you know needing more help with is really the core networking is where I'm working. So kind of treating it like as if it's a really big um, traditional provider network, in a way.
So they're leveraging your expertise in the routing and the traffic engineering.
Yep. Yep.
Let's take a quick break to hear a message from sponsor Megaport. If you're managing enterprise networks across multiple data centers and regions, you know the struggle. Long provisioning times, rigid contracts, and unpredictable costs that make scaling a nightmare. That's where Megaport changes the game. With Megaport's software-defined network, you can deploy on-demand private connectivity in 60 seconds. Connect instantly to over 930 data centers and 280 clouds all over the world with just a few clicks. No waiting months for circuits, no dealing with telcos, just secure, scalable interconnectivity. And here's the best part. You can start for free. Packet Pushers listeners can get a port or a Megaport cloud router completely free for the first month to experience how quick and easy it is to interconnect data centers and clouds and scale networks across regions without long-term commitments or hardware dependencies. Getting started is simple. Just go to megaport.com/trymegaport and start deploying scalable connectivity in minutes, not months. That's megaport.com/trymegaport, all one word. And now, back to the podcast.
Now, we were talking before the show, Andrew, and you mentioned that the service provider track, as far as you can tell, is the least popular of the Cisco CCIE
Yeah.
tracks.
Hmm.
So let's drill in on why that might be. What's the job opportunity? What's the typical compensation if I'm a CCIE SP? Are there jobs in demand? I mean, is this something that if I go to the trouble to get this thing, because it's a beast,
Yeah.
am I going to get hired and be well paid for my work?
Yeah. I've always heard that the salaries in service providers are a little bit lower than enterprise, and I haven't found that to be super true, but I can see that. The compensation I see just from job postings and stuff for where they want the CCISP is kind of in the 120 to 180K range. It depends on the person's experience and stuff, their location and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I think with the service provider area, there's kind of this combination of there's way less jobs. Like if you search for job postings with CCIE SP compared to CCIE EI, it's just going to be a huge discrepancy. But at the same time, there's just way less people qualified for those. So I don't know if it's any harder to find a CCIE SP job versus a CCIE tailored job for an enterprise person. Um, and I still think it's a great move. Like in my case, I don't have 20 years experience. So going from CCNP to CCIE was a nice way to really get access to more of these senior level
Mm,
jobs.
mm.
There's always buzz, as the years go on, is the CCIE worth it and stuff. And I can see both perspectives, but for me, I think it's absolutely worth it. The kind of danger though is that if you're looking at the CCIE for more compensation for these jobs, that's probably not going to be a motivator that's going to carry you through the study process because the study process is just so long. It's you're really only going to get through it if the primary focus is you're really interested in learning this and doing this. That's what's going to carry you through to the finish line.
I looked at the blueprint for SP and it did seem a bit daunting.
Oh yeah,
But
for
I
sure.
mean, yeah, yeah,
Y-
it did seem like a lot. Well, let's
mhm,
ask a different question then.
mhm.
What do you think the stress level is working up for a service provider versus an enterprise?
Um, yeah, it's pretty different. I think it depends on the place because for somebody that's in the lower ranks operationally, you're on call, you're dealing with customers. That is for sure way more stressful to me than enterprise jobs. But somebody studying for like at this level is most likely not going to be doing that. They're going to be more of on like a design team, a backbone team. They're going to be
Mhm.
insulated from customers. They're the places I've seen don't really have like an on call for this because they've got enough engineers dealing with the day to day stuff. Bigger providers are going to be kind of around the sun kind of thing. Um, so yeah, at an enterprise, the stress level can be really high too. It just depends if you're on a kind of a small team and you're just getting pulled in all different directions. What really drew me to the service provider world was that in the enterprise space, you don't really go that deep in networking. Like you need to know it, but I found that like I wasn't touching the routing protocols very much at all. Like OSPF or EIGRP was just kind of there and nobody
Yeah.
touched. Okay, maybe you're adding a new subnet today. Okay, woohoo! I get to put a new network statement or something, and that was about it. Okay,
Right?
now go back to my 10 tickets on firewall policies. This isn't working, and application
Exactly.
performance, and I need to add
Stand up a new VIP
wireless.
on the load balancer. Yeah, all that
Exactly.
stuff.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
maybe you're even managing DNS so with the service provider space, all of that is stripped away. That's what I love about it is that it's really more about, layer 1 through 3 and you need to know it really well and there's, problems of your IGP isn't allowing you to engineer traffic in a certain way. So now you're going to add some complexity, add TE tunnels, and maybe you need to move to segment routing. And there's just so much to learn there and you stay in the networking lane, kind of in my mind.
You're making this really appealing to me, I gotta say.
Yeah.
I like you really are.
Yeah,
So those are the
it's
places I was
fun.
always happiest is doing that kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well, okay, so let's say I'm a CCIE route switch, which I am, or I
Mhm.
was before I let it expire.
Yeah.
Or maybe today let's say I'm enterprise infrastructure
Mhm.
holder. What percentage of the service provider blueprint do I already know?
I would say maybe 30%, which sounds a little low, but it's this really foundational 30%. Back in the day, like maybe 10 years ago, the overlap was a lot more. But
It
as the
was
service
for
provider,
sure.
yeah, as the track progresses and matures, there's, segment routing is added. They've added things like 5G transport and stuff. And it's not a huge part of the exam, but as these things get added, the overlap, becomes less and less. But the great thing is that the overlap that there is so foundational that you can really have a good foot in the door into getting the CCIE SP. Because for the enterprise track, from what I've seen, you do like basic service provider networking. Like you might set up basic service provider MPLS network with LDP. You have to set up L3
Mhm.
VPN and do the PEC routing with BGP. Um, so you already know all this stuff, and now it's just a matter of learning new things, and you can relate it to what you already know. Like you can learn RCPTE and relate that to LDP. You already understand MPLS and push pop and swap and stuff. SR is not a huge stretch to learn because LDP, and SR is kind of more simple than LDP. You remove this whole extra protocol and you're just doing kind of labeling within the IGP itself. Then you learn SRv6 and relate that to SR. Um, so in some ways, it's actually kind of a requirement to have CCIE RS or EI because you can kind of flip the question around and say, well, can you do the CCIE SP without having CCIE RS or without having that level of knowledge? And I would say probably no. I'd say that you really need that foundational level of knowledge to go into the CCIE SP. And I actually started out my study process pretending like I was going for CCIE RS V5. I spent probably like 8 months doing that. I just did INE's program. I just kind of followed it exactly like I was going for it. I did all of their videos, read the books they recommend, did their lab workbook just in and out multiple times, did some full scale mock labs that they have. And I got to the point where I felt like if this real exam was actually being offered, I'd have some more prep to do, but I'm in like the phase where I'm like kind of 80% there or something. And then from there, I switched over to the CCIE SP so that I felt like I at least had that experience of going for the CCIE RS, and that set me up pretty well to then go into the CCIE SP stuff. Because if you're not going to do that, I think you're just going to get too frustrated. Like you're just going to go into multicast VPN. You're just gonna be like, I don't understand this. Like there's GRE tunnels, and I don't really have a good enough grasp of multicast in the first place. So it's just going to be an easier journey if you start with that. And so if you already have CCIE Enterprise or RS, you have the best start that you could have really to going for the CCIE SP. So it's for sure within your reach. You already have a CCIE, so you've demonstrated that you can put in the work and put in the time. So it's really just a matter of, do you have the time and energy and motivation to just kind of see it out and do it.
So you've touched on a couple of things like SRv6. Can you kind of give us a walkthrough of the technologies you'd be expected to know on the SP track?
Yeah, so the blueprint is pretty big. There's kind of an understatement, I guess.
I'm just laughing because I went through that PDF going, wow, okay, there's a lot.
Yeah, the nice thing is that I looked at that too, even after doing CCNP Service Provider, and it still felt pretty daunting. But the nice thing is that some of these new things that they've added, they're not going super hard on those topics. So like, I think a lot of people are seeing things like 5G transport. You're just, oh no, I don't know anything about 5G. I don't work with it. You don't need to know it from like a mobile perspective. It's more just about understanding the underlying networking and some of the tools there are, like Flux Algo for segment routing, and to kind of create different planes and stuff, and optimize things for, like you can do SRTE for low latency and those sorts of things. So it's more in lines of those, of the network engineer that's supporting the network that supports 5G. And there's very strict requirements in the front haul, like in the access layer. There's timing requirements for 5G, so you need to know PTP well. There's like a whole book about PTP and timing that I read from some Cisco engineers.
Wow.
Yeah, so those next generation stuff, you're definitely gonna have to spend some time on it, but there's a lot of resources available there. And I didn't look at that stuff until kind of later in my studies. So I had the foundation of segment routing and IGPs and BGP and stuff. So then adding in things like doing BGP colors for traffic engineering paths, it's not too much of a stretch at that point. If you start with that, I think it's going to be too confusing. But once you get to that point, it's definitely possible to learn what you need to know for the SP exam. So yeah, the core routing protocols like ISIS, OSPF, BGP, you're going to need to know that very deeply. With the IGPs, it's not really like multi-area IGP, like where the CCIE RS or the EIs, the complexity there might be like route redistribution into like different IGP processes and like multi-area IGPs, and how OSPF does NSSA areas, totally NSSA. That's not too much of a thing for the service provider. It's more about like single area IGP and finding really the way to optimize that as much as possible. Like you're going to understand the SPF timers and stuff. Like every knob there is under router OSPF, you're going to end up learning. And you're going to know the exact process of how the IGP converges. Like everything that happens from the link going down to now OSPF is fully converged. And you're going to start inserting into their fast reroute mechanisms and learn all the differences and all the different ways and kind of the history behind how fast reroute has been kind of developed and the history behind it, so that because service providers always had this need to just have as little downtime as possible, and it kind of comes from like IP routing needing to facilitate fast reroute, like it's inherently there in things like Sonnet and stuff. So it's like if you like these kinds of topics, it's really interesting. You'll get really down into the weeds, and
I do.
yeah, yeah, and you know this it's very satisfying to like feel like, yeah, I really now am understanding how OSPF works. Where as like at the CCNP level, it's more like, okay, yeah, I know how multi-area works and the summarization works. This is kind of the more low level of like the timers and those sorts of things that you get into. Yeah, then there's multicast, super deep. I mean, everything about multicast you can imagine, like IPv6, Anycast RP, interdomain multicast, like with MSDP and stuff. And then, you know, you go even further with multicast VPNs. And then MPLS is just a huge topic, of course. So a lot of the focus is on segment routing. That's kind of where the the world is kind of going. Um, but you still need to know LDP and RCPTE, and RCPT is like a really hard topic, in my opinion, to get into. But it's just a lot of labbing, knowing all the different knobs. There's just so many different knobs, and there's fast reroute that you can do with RCPTE, and there's, you know, do you want to do fast reroute for link protection, for node protection, for SRLG protection? It's just all these different options. And when you're studying for this, you just have to, you feel like, okay, well, I just need to know how to do everything. They could ask me anything. So I'm just going to have to prepare all of this and yeah, go into it as deeply as you can. And then segment routing is just going to be a huge thing. Luckily, there's some great books for segment routing by Clarence Philphills. And he just wrote a new one, part 3 that came out. It wasn't available when I was doing the exam, but part 3 is out for SRv6. Yeah, and with segment routing, I think people will really enjoy that topic, because if you've already gone through LDP and RCPTE, it kind of takes away all those disadvantages, like all the heaviness of the RCPTE state and the network and the path setup and all that kind of stuff just goes away. And now you can do traffic engineering in this very light manner where you can just program the entire path at the very source router, and you don't have to have all this state in the network. You don't have to worry about, okay, am I going to have 400 LSPs in the network, and how are my routers going to handle that? And those kind of concerns go away, and you get full 100% fast reroute protection with SR that historically they could never really meet that. You know, it was always dependent on the topology. If the topology is a certain way, the router can't actually calculate a fast reroute path for it. Yeah, you can get into kind of the math of like PQ space and everything. So if you enjoy going, you know, down into that, you know, I really liked, you know, learning that stuff. And then SRv6 is kind of, I think that just got added in the update from version 5 to version 5.1. And 5.1 is the exam I went for, and that, you know, my workbook is based on. And yeah, SRv6 is really neat. At first, it was kind of hard to conceptualize because it's kind of like doing MPLS, but at the IPv6 layer, like with IPv6 addresses. So like with these things they call micro SIDs, you can like steer a path just with simply this one destination IPv6 address. You can kind of do these like MPLS operations of like popping labels off, where you like pop parts of the IPv6 address off. You kind of shift the bits of the address over. But what's so nice about SRv6 is that it lends itself to summarization, because it just uses IPv6 forwarding. You don't have MPLS at all. And you can do summarization of like, you know, a /48 or something, and you can grow a really big network. And instead of having to do like BGP label unicast, that's another topic you'll kind of get into on this, is like unified MPLS, or they call it seamless MPLS. So instead of having to do that, you can just do SRv6 and just do a whole IPv6 only network. You can have like P nodes. So like in the traditional sense, P nodes are just MPLS nodes that don't run BGP. They don't have to care about the BGP services on top. They just switch on MPLS labels, and the equivalent of that for SRv6 is just like a dumb IPv6 forwarding node that it just needs to do IPv6 routing, and that's it. And you can support SRv6 for that. Um, so yeah, then there's a lot of layer 2 stuff. And the enterprise track, layer 2 is really about like switching, trunking and spanning tree and all the spanning tree knobs. In the service provider track, layer 2 is more about providing services like, VPLS, EVPN, switched LAN as a service, point-to-point services. Um, and there are some service providers that have layer 2 in their access network, but you don't use spanning tree there for loop prevention because it's just too slow. So
Yeah.
there's techniques like G8032 ring protection that is a topic on this exam. There's some complex layer 2 multi-homing, like if you have a customer that's VPLS and they want a multi-homed handoff for redundancy, there's some complexity there of doing multi-homing for layer 2, like there's some topics on spanning tree access gateway and stuff. But layer 2 isn't a huge part of it. Is you more need to know things like Q and Q and tag manipulation, like popping tags, translating tags, things like that. Which is not. It's kind of more complicated than it sounds, in my opinion. It's not too crazy to learn. Um, and then the security stuff is a lot of it is BGP, like internet security, BGP filtering policies. You know, just learning about anti-spoofing and remote trigger black hole, um, BGP flow spec, which is kind of like a more advanced version of remote trigger black hole. BGP flow spec is just kind of like um, you can like program firewall filter entries on all your routers at once through BGP. Like BGP like advertises a firewall filter. Like if the destination is this address and the protocol is this, then drop the traffic at the edge. Something like that. Um,
Okay, there's a ton here. In
yeah,
this,
yeah, yeah,
absolute
yeah,
ton here.
yeah.
All right, we
Then,
got a couple of questions that came in,
mhm,
Andrew,
yep,
on the how to approach this from a study perspective.
hmm
So we got a listener, Yap, he asks, if you were starting from scratch, what would be a good plan of attack? And some of this we've kind of mentioned, but maybe fill in some blanks here. And so from
yeah,
Yap's perspective, like which resources in order would you recommend? Because there isn't a lot of official material for the service provider track, not even really with the
yeah,
CCNP SP stuff.
right.
So how do you get your head around this thing and come up with your study plan?
Yeah, I definitely sympathize with this because at some point I didn't know anything about MPLS at all. So you have to start somewhere. And my top recommendation, if you don't know MPLS, you don't know anything about service provider networking, I would start with a course from Keith Barker of CVT Nuggets called MPLS Fundamentals. That's like a 10-year-old course, but that's what I started with. It's not super long, but you'll build an MPLS network, you'll build L3 VPN. I think he does everything just in GNS3 with just iOS nodes. So it's super easy to start. He'll walk you through it, kind of beginner level MPLS. Um, and then from there, the book that I think that is most accessible for people starting out is probably MPLS Fundamentals by Luke DeGain. Um, that's a book that will walk you through so many different things of MPLS, but in a way that's not super, intimidating if you don't know too much about it. Um, Another resource you might use is Renee Molinar's networklessons.com. He has like a course on MPLS, and I haven't done it, but I took a look at it and it looks like pretty beginner friendly. Um, so I think those things would be enough to start out with if you're new to MPLS. You'll kind of get a feel for if this is interesting to you and if it kind of clicks for you and stuff. The tough thing is that for some of these topics, you at some point you kind of have to make a little bit of a jump into more advanced material to kind of
Yeah.
learn the more difficult things, and there's not too many
I
ways
gotta say,
around
man,
that.
I have bought a variety of MPLS books over
Mm-hmm.
time, and I have found them so inscrutable, just so difficult to read
Yeah.
the copy.
Yeah.
because it's not written. It's like this, this person's got all this incredible amount of
Oh,
information
yeah.
in their head that they've put down, but the way they expressed it is just so unapproachable. I found it, frustrating.
Yeah, I think I had that exact experience with MPLS enabled applications, that book. That might
that
be one.
book, yes.
Yes. And I read that at first, and it starts out, I think, with MPLS TE and talking about service providers' need for TE and stuff. And I was like, what in the world is this talking about? And the funny thing is with a lot of these things, I just kept going around in circles where I'd keep coming back to things and getting a little bit into it and just getting that exposure kind of helped for the next thing and then the next thing. And I kind of went going round and round. But then I came back to that book, kind of halfway through my CCIE SP studies. And I found it really enjoyable to read because I felt like, oh, now I know what MPLS TE is. And it's this way of, it's like a book that it's kind of beautiful in how they describe how MPLS works. Like it's not just the nuts and bolts of, okay, you're going to receive label 18 on here. You're going to swap to label 20 because that's what LDP advertised. It's kind of the more bigger picture, I guess, and you kind of need to know it MPLS in depth first to really appreciate a book like that. But yeah, I know what you mean that some of these books, I also felt that way a little bit too with a book like MPLS and the SDN network. That's a book that's become very popular. And it's the same kind of thing where like, okay, here's a chapter on how MPLS works. Now here's a chapter on MPLS TE. Here's a chapter on segment routing. And I prefer just taking things one step at a time. Like there's an entire book for MPLS TE that I read that I like that a lot better. Like an entire chapter to like why we need this, an entire chapter to the IGP extensions, an entire chapter to the traffic engineering database, an entire chapter to the constraints that you can use. And that like more slow approach was kind of worked well for me.
Do you have any? We have another listener question from Kenyon. Insider recommendations on a study plan and training, and I think we were sort of already getting there with your approach of it sounds like you're building on foundational knowledge and then going deep.
Yeah, really. There's kind of two things to this. Like on the one hand, like for the study plan for the service provider CCIE, it's a lot of it is just about like finding a list of CCIE SP books online and it's going to be like 20 books and just read them all and lab them all. And that's just kind of what there is to that. But then there's a lot of tips for the actual final prep that might be useful for people. So Cisco has some paid practice labs for the CCIE SP as well as like a couple other tracks. There's like 5 different topics for these. They're each give you a 4-hour reservation. So like you VPN into their network to access their actual virtualization stuff. Each 4-hour session is $50. But this gives you a great feel for what the exam is really like. So you like the tasks are kind of written in a similar style. You get a feel for like the requirements and the restrictions and kind of the length of a task prompt. You get a feel for like the delivery format. So like the web-based console session manager and how you have to right click and then select paste. Like right click doesn't just automatically paste. Like there's these sorts of things you have to just get used to with their environment. You get used to like the topology diagram and how to zoom in and out and those kind of small things that are really important to be familiar with on the lab so that when you sit the lab, you can focus on solving the problems, not wait, where is router number 15? And okay, let me assume I can't find 15 when, those sorts of things. So yeah, those are definitely a must do for preparing for your first attempt. And then there's a full scale practice lab that's really great. So this guy, Avi is what I call him. His full name is like Ovidiu Madeline Rose. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. He's from Romania, but he passed the V5 service provider like a year or two before I did. He made these 2 really great courses. He made one on EVPN and one on segment routing on his website, like ping-factory.com. And then he also has a full scale lab and he made a YouTube playlist for the solution for it. So there's like this 30 video playlist where he goes into every single task and explains the solution. And I did this lab like pretty close to when I did my first attempt. And it took me 5 hours to complete it. And I would say that's on par with the real exam because the real exam, you have a 5-hour window to do the configuration. So if you can configure his full lab in 5 hours, you're in good shape to sit for the real lab. And then you're also just gonna need to make your own full scale labs. So I would just take all of the practice tasks that you've gotten from the official Cisco practice labs and just kind of create your own full scale labs. And that's going to be the best way to actually prepare for your first attempt.
Hmm. Without breaking the NDA covering your exam, because we all know about those Cisco NDAs, what can you share about your service provider lab experience?
Yeah, it was a really, really tough exam. So my first attempt, I knew that I was going to fail. Like I figured, well, if Nick Russo wrote his entire SPV4 workbook, 3,000 pages, and then sat his first attempt and failed, there's no way I'm going to pass my first attempt. So it kind of eased the pressure.
Mm.
And
You lower the expectation. Hey, if
exactly.
Nick's not going to do it, I'm definitely not going to do it.
Oh,
So
yeah.
let's just go in and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. I figured there are two outcomes. Either I fail it and I feel like I just cannot do this. This is not accessible to me. Or I fail it and I feel like, well, I think I can pass this. And that was luckily it was the second outcome. I ended up passing on my second attempt. And the first attempt, I was kind of surprised at what was difficult because there was nothing where I felt like, oh no, I don't know how to do this, or I didn't study this protocol enough. Um, the difficulty was more like, I don't know if I'm making the right decision right now of how they're asking me to do this.
Which feels more like a CCDE sort of a problem.
Kind of, yeah, that's true. Yeah, in a way, it kind of was because, yeah, there would be things like, well, I can configure it this way or that way, but I'm not super clear on which way I should do it. And there's just a lot of mental fatigue that came from making all of those decisions.
And you could ask the proctor, and he'll say,
yeah,
no
they don't
help. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
You're supposed to be able to figure it out from the question. Dang it.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, there's even things that like maybe they'd ask you to do something a different way than you'd ever think of. Like an example would be like if they told you in this network use OSPF area 1 for the backbone, and you'd kind of think, okay, I guess that works. I mean, I just always do is area 0. Like, why would I use area 1? But then you start thinking, well, is that going to impact SR? Is that going to impact SRTE? I don't really know because I haven't done it this way. And if your SRT policy doesn't come up, or like, is it because I'm doing area 1? Is there something because I'm not in the backbone area? I mean, that's not a real example, but it just kind of gives you that sense of like, kind of think, I didn't really do it this way before. I just kind of want to go home and lab up this way so that I'm completely sure that it works how I think it should. So that's why you just need to do it one time and then just go home, and for the next 30 days, that was all my life was focused on, and just all these problems were just kind of rattling around my head and just thinking of, do they want me to do it like that? Well, if I do it like that, does that impact something else? Okay, actually, yeah, I think I should do it this other way. Okay, yeah, on the second time, I'm gonna have that in mind. That sort of thing.
So one of the reasons we wanted to bring you on is because you, after all the work you did, created a CCIE SP workbook. So can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, definitely. So the workbook I made was really my primary study tool. So I didn't really create notes. I instead just created lab exercises, and I kind of embedded my notes inside of the explanation for that particular lab exercise. And I was really influenced by INE's RS V5 workbook. I found that it was such a effective use of time, and this kind of method of active recall. Like instead of just passively rereading notes and rereading books and stuff, or watching somebody else configure it in a video, it just forces you to solve this yourself, to draw upon what you remember. And it was just this really quick process to recall things. And I found that I just needed to do it this way to remember topics along the way, because the study journey is just so long. So maybe you learned multicast 4 months ago, and then you feel like, okay, well, now I kind of forgot some stuff about multicast, but I'm not just going to reread the books and stuff. That doesn't make sense. So I just redid my practice exercises that I created. So at the end of this, I basically had a full workbook for the SP, the current version of it, 5.1. I'd done all the exercises, multiple times and everything. And when I passed the lab, I decided to just release it to the public because it seemed a shame just to let all of these exercises just sit there. Nobody's going to use them anymore when there might be other people like me that are looking for a workbook like this. So yeah, I just went through all of the labs again and verified that they all make sense because I just wrote these all for myself. So now I had to go through them and think, okay, well now I'm writing this for other people. Is somebody else going to understand what I mean here? Um, yeah, then I released it just online for free for on Gitbook. Um, I made a Git repo of all the startup configs and stuff. So if you're somebody going for this exam, I think it's gonna help you a lot because it saves study time. You know, you're not gonna have to configure IP addresses and everything on every time you lab. You can just kind of load up one of these startup configs and all that's there. And you know, you get challenge problems like, okay, this isn't working. OSPF isn't working, or OSPF is taking the wrong path. Fix it and fix it by only configuring these routers and that sort of stuff that you need somebody else to create for you. You can't really create your own troubleshooting problems because you know what's wrong with it. You know.
And you decided on Container Lab as the labbing tool for the workbook. Why Container
Yeah.
Lab?
Yeah.
Especially
So
because I mean, Container Lab's open source, but it was born out of Nokia, and we're talking about a Cisco exam. So
that's true. Yeah. Yeah. I kind of gotten forced into having to use Container Lab when I was preparing for my first attempt because I need to lab really big topologies and XRV 9K was just not going to work. The resource requirements are just way too heavy. You know, it needs like 4 CPU and like 20 gigs of RAM. I could run a few of them at a time, but I can't run 50 of them. And the XRV is too old. It supports some segment routing stuff, but not some newer features. It doesn't support SRv6. So I was kind of stuck there. So the last option was really just to use XRD, which is even a little bit more lightweight than XRV, but has almost all of the support of like an XRV 9K. And XRD is a containerized version of XR, so you just can't really run it on CML or even G. So Container Lab was just kind of the solution for that. So I had to install Container Lab and set it up, and I found, oh, this is actually really nice. You know, there's just so many benefits here. There's no limit to the number of nodes I can run. I don't have to pay a yearly subscription. It uses very low disk utilization. Like on CML and EVE-NG, you kind of got like each node is like a VM, and the disk is saved, and your disk can end up filling up the more labs you have on it. But with Container Lab, the way I used it is just every lab is just always a wipe and always start from new, and I just transfer the config files over that I need. So I could just get away with like 100 gig disk for Container Lab and just be totally fine and never run out of memory. And then it also made it easy to import containers for things like for BGP RPKI. I would use like the official Routinator container for that, and you just load it in, and it's a couple lines in the YAML config, and that's it. For NSO, just use an Ubuntu container and put NSO on it. You know, it was just it seemed like it was just so much quicker to get up and running with labs.
I think you said a keyword there when you said YAML. That is, Container Lab labs are defined by a YAML file, so that when you stand up the lab, it's already, you've got links that are connected. You can have IP addresses that are done. You can have a variety of configuration already completed for you as a function of that YAML file, right?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, and that YAML file can be kind of the hang up for people making, you know, if they're looking at making a switch from EVE-NG to Container Lab. Because with EVE-NG, with CML, with GNS3, you click between nodes to create links, and you can drag links around and stuff. With Container Lab, the links are defined as a line in the YAML file. So that can be a little bit cumbersome for people at first, but there's constant development for Container Lab. There was a VS Code extension recently released that allows you to visualize your Container Lab YAML file and click to drag links around, you know, click and do a PCAP on a link, all that kind of stuff. They just added an API to it. So yeah, all of these maybe hangups that people might have, they're always developing solutions to, you know, make the transition, you know, easier if you want to get into Container Lab.
You mentioned the XRD image. How do you get a hold of that thing? Do you have to have a Cisco contract? Because I tried to download it, and they said no.
Oh, okay.
We're
Yeah,
kind at all.
yeah, I guess you probably have to have a valid contract. I was at a Cisco shop, so I just logged in with my Cisco account, and I just gave me access to it, and then I didn't have to request access or anything. But
Okay.
yeah, that might be
Yeah, I mean,
the
I have an
problem.
account, but
Uh-huh.
I haven't had a
Like
SmartNet
a
account for a
valid,
long time.
yeah, yeah, that might be the problem then. I don't know if they would, work with somebody that if you just tell, hey, I just need a lab with this. Can you let me download it? They might. I don't know, but yeah, the
Yeah, I
XRD,
could reach out to somebody. Yeah, yeah, and see.
yeah, the but the SRD is just, I think it's a must have for people labbing for CCIE SP because it only needs like one CPU and 2 gigs of RAM. It's just so
Well,
lightweight, and you can
yeah,
do.
like as a Camel user, you
Mhm,
get all those images, and I think XR9. I'm pretty sure XR9K is in that
mhm,
bundle. But as you said, it's such a beast. It wants so much that
yeah,
plus it takes forever to boot. That
right.
just to get
Yep.
the lab started.
Oh yeah, for
So
sure.
that is not the way if you're trying to be
Yeah.
efficient.
Yeah, the XRD boots very quickly. It makes labbing so much easier. There's a couple things it doesn't support, like it doesn't support .1Q tag rewrites. It doesn't support most of the multicast forwarding stuff, but everything else it supports. And I'm talking specifically about the control plane XRD. There's a V router XRD. And when I first learned about this, I thought, oh, I think I need a V router because the control plane is just like for a route reflector or stuff. Um, but that's not the case. The XRD is very close to XRv9K support, and the XRD V router actually requires like a PCIe pass through NIC stuff. Like it's not really possible to lab that up.
Mm.
So yeah, for sure, XRD is the way to go for people that are labbing for this.
How well would you say the labs you've come up with kind of map to the official blueprint?
I think they line up extremely well, especially the configuration stuff. Because everything, the labs were driven from the blueprint because I would look at the blueprint and think, okay, I need to be able to configure this. So I'm going to create some labs on it.
Mhm.
So the blueprint really drove the labs. There's definitely some things, like some design things, like we were talking about the 5G transport design, routed optical networking, BNG, Cisco's BNG solution, MaxSec, these kinds of things where it's like maybe a design verb on the blueprint. And for those, I just use Cisco live presentations mostly and Cisco's white papers on those things. So yeah, it's you have a way. You're not going to find that on the workbook, but there's ways to learn what you need to know. Um, Same thing for some layer two things like spanning tree access gateway, multi chassis lag. I Some of these things I did include my notes because I thought it was be kind of helpful to just include notes on it. So you'll see in the lab it just says notes dash MC lag or something because you can't configure it.
Mm.
But yeah, otherwise I think this is the as close to a complete V5.1
Wow.
workbook you'll be able to see because there was very limited V5 workbooks in the first place, and those may not have been updated for the new stuff like SRv6. So yeah.
I clicked through in the Gitbook page and was
Mhm.
looking at the sheer volume of them. It is astonishing how much is in there, and I was wondering, it's
Thanks.
like, is it complete? And the answer is, yeah, pretty darn close. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't gone through every single blueprint item and smashed, okay, yeah, this is 100% covered in the workbook, but yeah, I think for somebody that's going for this, they're going to use all the resources they can get. So they'll find out if something they're looking for isn't there, and if there's something there that you think I could create a lab for, definitely let me know. I'd be interested in adding to the workbook. The workbook is just a web page. It's not like a static PDF, so I can always add things, correct things and things like that. So
Yeah, well, that was actually another question I had. Can people help you with the workbook? And it sounds like the answer is they come up with labs, and what would the process be from there?
yeah, if they want to add labs to the workbook, yeah, they definitely could. They would either use a startup config that I've already got there existing, or send me, the startup config files it needs. And if you're using one of my existing topologies, you can use that, or you can create a new topology. And I would need the YAML file. Yeah, then write up, the answer and the explanation, and if you can match the style I'm doing with screenshots and stuff, or I can add that. Yeah, that would definitely be helpful if you see gaps on things that we could add workbook exercises for. um, yeah, and I'm kind of interested to see if I can't really tell on like some of these workbook prompts. Does that make sense to other people or not? So if people see things where like, hey, I just don't understand this task, like this doesn't really make sense. That'd be good to know because I didn't really have a good way of I didn't have anybody edit it or anything. So, I could
Mm.
change some stuff around and edit things and things like that. If you see typos or whatever, I'm happy to fix it and make it as good as possible.
It's Git book, but it's not a Git repo, as in I couldn't do like a pull request to make a change.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, the Git book is not like a Git repo, but the lab files are a separate repo. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Andrew, what's your next CCIE track? You gonna do another one?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't see myself doing another one. I don't know which one would even be interesting to me because, some I can just rule out. I'm not going to do security or, wireless or things like that. I mean, the data center one might be kind of interesting, but I'm not sure if I want to do ACI and those sorts of things.
Andrew, how do
And
folks follow you?
yeah, they can follow me at LinkedIn is probably the best way. If you just search my name, Andrew Ohanian, or the URL like LinkedIn/in/Andrew Ohanian would work. Yeah, you can connect with me there, and let me know if you have any problems with running the labs, or if you like them, or again if things need to change or be corrected and things like that.
Thank you, Andrew, and
Mhm.
really appreciate the time, not just for recording with us, which took a
Mhm.
mere hour, but the amount of time you put into that lab workbook. You
Oh,
had told
thanks.
me offline you were guessing what, hundreds or even 1,000 hours?
Yeah, yeah, because somebody else asked me this, and it was hard to estimate because the labs were really such a primary resource of my studying. The labs really represent like the totality of my study for the CCIE.
Mm.
So it's probably was over 1,000 hours. My study schedule was probably around 3 hours a day. I tried to do like 7 days a week. So
Wow.
if you kind of multiply that out by 2 years, that kind of gives you an idea, I guess, of
That's
not every
amazing.
hour was spent on a workbook exercise, but anything I was doing that wasn't reading, and typing on the keyboard for labbing was kind of just making the workbook exercises. So,
Amazing stuff.
yeah.
Okay, Andrew Ohanian, thank you very much for
Mhm.
joining us on Heavy
Yeah.
Networking.
Mhm.
What a representation of work and dedication,
No,
and
thanks.
thanks for all of that. And again, you can find Andrew on LinkedIn. We will have a link to Andrew's page on LinkedIn and all the resources that we talked about in this show. We're going to have a whole stack of them here. And you'll be able to find that all at packetpushers.net. Just drill into the Heavy Networking podcast page and find this episode. All the links will be there. I'll probably publish them on LinkedIn or something too, just to
Mhm.
help make some noise about this track. And of course, Andrew's workbook page is on Gitbook, ccie-sp.gitbook.io. Hop in there, and there's no login, there's no drama, there's no signups, there's no pop-ups,
Mhm.
there's no just go in and get to work. There's just a ton of
Mhm.
information there. It's absolutely a rich resource. So thanks for listening to Heavy Networking. And if you love the esoteric nerdery that is any of the CCIE tracks, my take is you're especially sure to love the service provider track. I was going through the blueprint to prep for this show, and I was just reminded of how particular a service provider network can be to handle different traffic classes and multi-tenancy and automation and so on. There is so much there, including like segment routing, some newer forwarding paradigms that are just like you got to get your head around it because these things are becoming normal. They're no longer like emerging and trendy and ooh, will this happen? It's happening. It's happening. So if you have questions or comments about today's podcast or you got a topic request, you can send that to us via packetpushers.net/follow up. And then you can please do all the things at packetpushers.net. You can join our community Slack. You can sign up for our free newsletters because they don't suck. You could buy some merch. You could subscribe to various things, leave comments, smash like buttons wherever you're watching or listening. and seriously, share the joy of Packet Pushers with your friends. We would really appreciate that as we keep rolling through what has sadly become interesting times. You never want to live through interesting times, right? Well, we're in the middle of them, folks. Okay, until next week, I've been Ethan Banks with Drew Conray Murray. And just remember that too much networking would never be enough.